On a damp spring night in 1871, on the pine edge of a North Carolina village where the road turned to clay and the river kept its own counsel, a child came into the world without a cry, as if sound itself feared him. The cabin air tasted like iron and wet wood. The midwife, Mary Kincaid, worked with clean hands and a neat mind, boiling her thread, laying out pins in a straight line as she always did, a small ritual that gave sense to blood and fear. The mother, Ruth Ellison, stared at the rafters and counted her breaths while the father waited outside with a lantern that would not hold its flame. When the child slid free, the light brightened as though fed, then thinned to a weak bead. The baby lay still, pale and damp, and in the hush between first and second breath, a faint shimmer moved across his skin like the last wash of twilight. Mary did not speak. She wrapped him in cloth and lifted him near the window. Moonlight pressed onto him and did not leave. It lingered, a soft stain, no brighter than frost, yet wrong to the eye. Ruth reached for him and flinched as if heat pricked her palms. She told herself it was fear. Mary tied off the cord with a double knot and looked for signs she knew how to name. She found none, only the sheen, and the way milk cooled too fast in the bowl by the bed. By morning, a doctor rode up, glanced once, and refused to sign the county book. He said nothing to Ruth. He only set his pen down like a verdict and left the page blank because a blank page cannot accuse. Word moved through the village in quiet lines. Men spoke at the mill. Women watched their wells. Children were kept indoors at dusk. Some called it a wonder. Some called it a mark. Most said nothing because silence had always been the safest language here. That very night, Mary Kincaid failed to go home. Her small satchel, the one with folded gauze and salted needles, was found under the porch as if it had crawled there to hide. The yard dirt showed a pair of prints that did not match her feet or Ruth's, small and careful, toes pointed straight, like someone who practiced walking until even the ground believed him. In town, a man with a ledger crossed out the midwife's name with a ruler edge so the line would be clean. He bought sacks of salt and told the clerk the summer hogs spoiled early. He kept his nails short and his smile shorter. He was the kind of man who taught himself never to look twice at anything that asked for help. In the cabin, the infant slept and the glow built when the room went still. A pulse that followed the slow beat in Ruth's wrist. The lantern would not hold a flame near his crib. The wick burned low and made a ring of soot on the glass like a mouth that could not close. At church the next day, the preacher prayed about angels, but his eyes went to the empty bench where Mary should have sat. The village shifted around the news without daring to face it. A miracle is easier to hold than a question with teeth. In the ledger, the blank space after the child's name pleased the man who kept order, because he knew from patient habit that what is not written cannot be accused, and what cannot be accused can be used. In the quiet of that first week, the baby learned to sleep best when the moon climbed, and every night the stain of light on his skin grew a shade bolder as if fed by attention. It would be said later that this was the night the town chose its role, to turn away, to call danger holy, and to leave room for a careful mind to work in the dark. By the third month of his life, the Ellison child had become more than an infant to the villagers. He was an omen they could not name but felt in their marrow. His skin, which once glowed like damp frost, now carried a pulse faint and steady as though a lantern wick had been hidden inside his chest. Chickens scattered from the yard and clawed at their own cages rather than be near the house. Dogs that had once slept by Ruth's porch whined at night and tore their paws bloody against their chains until they were let loose to vanish into the trees. Milk would not last in his room. It soured in the space of an hour, clumping in the bowl as if the child's very breath curdled it. When Ruth tried to feed him, the milk in her breast thickened painfully, and she bit her lip until blood ran just to keep from screaming at the sting of it. Yet she endured, because she told herself mothers endure, though something inside her was already cracking under the weight of what she carried. At night, the crib became its own beacon. From the dirt path, a passerby might see a dim glow pressing through the slats of wood, weak but wrong, like the halo of a coal that refused to die. Neighbors who wandered too close claimed the light moved like water, rippling across the cloth, bending in time with the child's shallow breaths. When anyone dared stare too long, a sickness began. The back of the skull tightened, the tongue dried out, and a crawling sensation moved beneath the skin as if tiny legs were threading pathways through the flesh. One farmer confessed that he scratched at his arms until ribbons of blood ran down, certain he could feel something alive burrowing there. Another woman swore her teeth loosened after looking too long, and two fell out within a week. Still no one accused Ruth. Instead, they spoke softly of curses, and in silence they fed their fear with stories that grew sharper than knives. The village had always known the comfort of rules: plant by the moon, reap in the heat, keep salt near the hearth, bury your dead with a coin to pay the way. But the child bent those rules in quiet ways. Bread would not rise if Ruth touched the dough. Water drew flies even when it ran fresh from the well. Once, when Ruth carried her son past the churchyard, the iron bell cracked down the middle without a hand laid on it, the sound ringing hollow like a jar struck with bone. The preacher told his flock it was a test of faith, yet his hands shook each time he lifted scripture, and the villagers noticed. They noticed everything, but fear stitched their mouths shut. At night, Ruth often stood over the crib, watching the glow seep through the thin blanket. The light was faint, but her eyes burned from staring too long. She began to mutter to herself, saying she could feel the light watching her back. Once in the dark, she pressed her palm against the infant's chest and felt the rhythm of his heart. It was not steady but staggered, with pauses that stretched too long, and each beat seemed to echo into her bones. When she pulled her hand away, her skin stung with tiny welts that traced the outline of her fingers, as though something beneath his skin had marked her for touching what should not be touched. The villagers began to avoid passing Ruth's home at night. Paths were redrawn, fences raised, excuses made. Yet one man passed deliberately night after night, his pace measured, his eyes fixed on the faint glow spilling through the window cracks. He did not believe in curses or angels. He believed in patterns, in the cold order of things that no one else dared write down. And in the glow of that crib he saw not a burden but a possibility. For what is feared can be used, and what is worshipped in silence can be shaped by hands that are patient enough. The child's glow was no longer a secret, but a lure. And in the shadows of that second spring, the first quiet hunger began to form, not from the infant, but from the mind already planning how to claim him. Ruth Ellison learned early that silence was her only protection. After the doctor's death, she kept her mouth closed even as whispers about her son pressed against the walls of her home like cold wind. She never spoke of the glow, never admitted what she saw each night when his small body burned faintly beneath the quilt. To the neighbors who came with bread or pity, she only smiled weakly and said the child was healthy, though her arms told a different story. Red welts bloomed across her skin, angry patches that healed into scars shaped like dripping wax. She wore shawls even in the thick of summer to hide the burns, but cloth could not mask the way she winced each time she gathered her son to her chest. It was as though every embrace left a brand, not from fire but from something deeper, something inside him that did not want to be held. At night she prayed, not in full words but in broken murmurs, fragments of scripture mixed with pleas that made no sense to those who overheard. A neighbor swore he heard her whisper not for protection but for restraint, begging that the glow remain confined to sleep, that it never awaken fully while the child's eyes were open. Her voice, cracked and hoarse, drifted out through the thin wood walls, and those who passed by the cabin quickened their steps, muttering that no mother should sound like that. Still none dared confront her. They saw the burns, they heard the prayers, but they looked away because looking too long left its own mark. Inside the cabin, Ruth built her life around rules. The crib was never placed near the fire, for flames bent strangely in the child's presence, curling sideways instead of up. She fed him only in darkness, where the glow was faintest, her face turned away as she pressed him to her breast. When the glow flared in sleep, she dared not wake him, for she believed his dreams were the source of it. And to wake a dreaming child was to rip open a place better left sealed. Sometimes she swore she could see shadows moving inside the glow, thin shapes that pressed against the skin as if something else lived beneath. When those nights came, she did not sleep. She sat rigid in a chair with her scarred arms wrapped in cloth, whispering the same 3 words over and over: "Stay within, stay within." The villagers grew more uneasy. They noticed Ruth walked with a strange calmness, her eyes dulled, her voice flat as stone. It was not grief nor madness, but something else, resignation, as though she had accepted a truth none of them could admit aloud. They asked if the glow was real, if the burns were real, but she gave them nothing. Her silence became a wall, and behind that wall something dark was growing. They began to fear not only the child but the mother too. For silence is its own kind of pact, and she had clearly made hers. One night, after her arms blistered fresh from holding him too long, Ruth bound them with strips of cloth dipped in vinegar. She sat by the crib, rocking slightly, her lips moving with words she no longer controlled. To anyone who might have entered, she would have looked like a woman broken by sleeplessness, but the truth was sharper. She was bargaining. She whispered to the glow itself, promising her own pain in exchange for the boy's rest, offering burns instead of screams, silence instead of exposure. She knew no one would believe her if she told the truth. That the glow had a will, that it burned not by accident but with intention, marking her as its vessel. Her silence was not weakness, it was complicity. By refusing to speak, Ruth protected the child from the world, but she also protected the glow from being destroyed. Each prayer, each hidden scar, each refusal to confess made her part of it, a willing participant in its quiet rule. And in that silence, the child learned, even without words, that the world outside would never name what he was. Darkness breeds where language dies, and Ruth Ellison's silence was the first soil in which the hunger could root itself. Reverend Malachi Gray was a man who believed that every wound could be closed with scripture if spoken loud enough. When the whispers about Ruth's child reached him, he saw not a burden but a trial, a chance to prove the reach of his faith. He spoke of it from the pulpit with careful fire, telling his flock that light belongs to God alone, and any other glow was a counterfeit flame. He chose not to call the child cursed, for that word would scatter the congregation, but instead spoke of purification, of the cleansing power of salt and the innocence of milk. They nodded because they were hungry for answers, and when a man in robes speaks with certainty, the fearful cling to certainty like it is bread. In truth, Malachi's confidence hid his own unease. He had seen the cracked bell, the scorched arms of the mother, the blank space where a doctor's name should have been written, and each detail pressed into him like a thorn. He was not driven by compassion, but by the itch to master what he could not explain. He prepared the ritual in secret, gathering the faithful in the church cellar under the cover of night. The floor was swept clean, a circle of salt poured with lines as straight as a mason's hand. In the center he placed a shallow basin of milk, cool and white, and he told them this would draw out whatever impurity lived in the child. Ruth stood silent, her face pale, clutching the boy against her chest. She did not protest when Malachi took the child from her arms, for silence had long been her only shield. He laid the infant naked in the basin, and the milk lapped gently at his sides. For a moment nothing stirred, and some breathed relief, thinking perhaps it would be simple. Then the glow began. It started as a soft pulse beneath the skin, a faint shimmer that drew their eyes despite themselves. But as they stared, the light sharpened into shapes, lines that bent and curled, forming symbols none could name, yet all recognized as wrong. They swore later that the symbols seemed to move, to crawl under the flesh as though written by a hand inside the child. The milk began to bubble, not from heat, but as if rejecting what touched it. The infant screamed, a sound so shrill it pierced their eardrums, and every candle in the cellar went out at once. In that sudden dark, the glow lit the room like a lantern, casting long shadows against the salt lines. One by one, the faithful fell to their knees. They clutched their stomachs, choking on their own breaths, and soon the sound of retching filled the cellar. Blood poured from their mouths in violent streams, splattering the floor, mixing with the milk that now ran black around the child's body. Some collapsed forward into their own vomit, their limbs twitching like marionettes with cut strings. The salt circle blurred as their bodies thrashed against it, smearing the line that was meant to hold the ritual intact. The stench grew unbearable, copper and curdled milk mingling into something that seared the nose. Malachi alone stood, trembling but unwilling to fall. He raised his hands to the heavens, shouting prayers into the choking air, insisting that this was a test, that God would not abandon him. But his words faltered when the glow burst into a sudden blaze. The child's skin shone so bright it bleached the cellar walls, forcing every eye shut. Malachi screamed then, not in defiance but in agony, clutching his face as a searing pain tore through his vision. When the light dimmed at last, the others lay silent, their blood pooling in thick red circles, their bodies slack as rag dolls. The child had ceased crying, lying still in the blackened milk, his glow faint again as if satisfied. Malachi stumbled blind, his eyes destroyed, the sockets burned so clean they looked carved. He groped for the wall, muttering that he had seen the truth, though his flock lay dead at his feet. Ruth snatched the child back into her arms, her lips moving without sound, and she fled the cellar into the cool night. She did not look back, for the glow behind her had already done enough. The village awoke to silence that reeked of blood, but few asked questions. They saw Malachi stumbling sightless through the streets, his eyes hollow, and they turned away, whispering that even the faithful had been broken. They did not ask what had happened in that cellar because they already knew. Some things cannot be purified, and some lights burn only to consume. The baby slept peacefully that night, his glow steady as though the screams and blood had been no more than a meal. And in the dark, Ruth understood that the hunger within her child was no longer bound by milk or touch. It had grown into something larger, something that fed on the devotion and suffering of others, and silence alone would not contain it for long. It began in silence, the way all true losses do. One spring morning, a mother woke to find her daughter's bed empty, the blanket folded neatly as though no child had ever slept there. Days later, another boy failed to return from the riverbank, his shoes left side by side on the mud as though placed by careful hands. A third vanished from his own yard, a wooden toy left rocking on the porch step. The village grew restless, but no one spoke the fear aloud because every whisper traced the path back to the Ellison house. To speak it was to accuse, and to accuse meant standing before that glow in the dark. Most preferred silence, though silence only fed what it should have starved. The pattern continued. Children disappeared in pairs, then alone, each vanishing, leaving no trace of struggle. Doors had not been forced, no blood marked the ground. It was as if the earth itself had opened and swallowed them whole. Families prayed, searched, pleaded, but their grief turned inward, ashamed, as though the loss was a personal failing rather than a wound carved into the heart of the town. Ruth moved through these days like a shadow. She neither denied nor admitted anything, only rocked her glowing child against her chest with arms wrapped in bandages, her lips pressed into a line that trembled, though no sound escaped. Some swore they saw a faint smile in her silence, not joy but a resignation too heavy for grief. The truth surfaced by accident. A farmhand repairing the Ellison barn dug shallowly into the packed dirt, floor, and struck bone. At first he thought it a dog or hog, but when he cleared the soil away he found the small skull of a child, its eye sockets packed with fine white dust. He fled, but curiosity and duty drew others back, and together they unearthed more bones. They lay not scattered but arranged in neat patterns, ribs aligned in curves, femurs stacked like spokes of a wheel. Even in death the children had been placed deliberately as though in ritual. What chilled them most was the glow. The bones pulsed faintly in the dirt, a dull light that flickered like embers beneath ash. No flame warmed the air, yet every witness swore they saw it. The sheriff was called, but he refused to enter the barn. He stood at the door, hat in hand, and declared the bones belonged to livestock long gone, that the glow was nothing more than lantern reflection in frightened eyes. He ordered the graves filled again, soil tamped firm. The matter closed. Those who tried to protest fell silent under his gaze, for they knew the sheriff's kind. A man who believed that what remained buried could not stain his ledger. He said the law did not dig up children on rumors, and the law became the wall behind which cowardice hid. Ruth claimed no knowledge. When pressed by trembling neighbors, her hands shook with an odd calmness, as though her body remembered grief, but her soul no longer bent beneath it. She spoke only once, saying the child she held was her only son, her only blood, her only charge. She did not flinch at the mention of bones beneath her feet, nor did she weep. It was as though grief had already been spent, burned away by the glow that curled against her breast each night. To the villagers, her calmness was worse than confession. It meant she had surrendered, not to God, not to despair, but to something older, something that asked no forgiveness. The barn was sealed, but rumors did not die. Children who still remained were kept indoors, chained by fear more than by lock or latch. Yet sometimes in the dead of night, parents swore they heard the faint sound of small feet moving across the dirt, as though the missing still wandered beneath the soil, restless in their patterns. The barn itself seemed to breathe in the heat of summer, the air thick and wet with the smell of earth that would not settle. And though the graves were covered, the glow did not fade. At night, the ground beneath the barn pulsed faintly, as though the bones below had learned to keep the child's secret alive. The town lived with it because survival demanded silence. Authorities dismissed it because order demanded blindness. And Ruth endured it because her silence had become her pact. In the end, the vanishings were not marked with funerals or hymns. They were marked only by the weight of absence, by the glow that whispered through the cracks in the barn floor, and by the quiet knowledge that evil had rooted itself in their soil, fed by children and protected by every adult, too, frightened to speak its name. Julian Hartwell came into the village with the look of a man who believed that the world's mysteries bent to ink and paper. He carried a leather-bound notebook worn at the edges, its pages filled with neat diagrams of bones, roots, and engines, the tools of a mind convinced that all things could be measured. He was no priest, no sheriff, and no farmer. He was something more dangerous, an outsider with the hunger of science and the confidence of one who thought knowledge could make him clean. When he first heard whispers of the glowing child, he smiled, not with disbelief but with calculation. He had chased stories of strange births before, and though most proved only superstition, he knew that when people spoke in hushed tones, something worth recording usually lay beneath. He asked questions with a calm voice, and at first the villagers answered. They told him of chickens that would not roost, of milk that soured in minutes, of lanterns that failed when placed near the crib. He wrote each word down, his hand steady, his mind already arranging patterns. He was most drawn to the tale of the barn, the bones arranged in deliberate order. Though the sheriff warned him to leave it buried, Hartwell bribed a farmhand to take him inside. In the dim light, he knelt over the soil and saw for himself the faint glow pressing through the dirt. He dug with careful fingers until a fragment of rib surfaced. its marrow glimmering like glass holding trapped light. He did not recoil. Instead, he marveled. He pressed it to his notebook, sketching furiously, his eyes wide with delight. To him, this was not curse nor miracle, but evidence of a failed creation, an accident of flesh that bent nature's rules. He told the farmhand that light had been caught in the body the way minerals catch fire in stone, and that such a thing proved nature was still experimenting, still fumbling with design. He called the Ellison child not a monster but a specimen, an incomplete draft of something the world had not meant to finish. His words frightened those who heard them, for in his detachment they sensed something colder than superstition. A man who cared nothing for the lost children or the mother's scars, only for what could be written, dissected, and preserved. As days passed, his obsession deepened. He returned often to Ruth's home, watching the crib from a distance, sketching the pulse of the glow that seeped through the cracks of wood. He noted how it seemed to strengthen when the child slept and dim when he woke, concluding that dreams themselves might be the fuel. His notebook grew crowded with diagrams of infant veins branching like wires, of lanterns drawn beside human ribs, of hearts imagined as engines meant to trap light. He began muttering to himself that the glow was not evil but wasteful, that the child carried within him the beginnings of something greater that nature had abandoned halfway. He told Ruth, though she never answered, that he wanted to finish what nature had failed to complete. Her silence suited him, for it left him free to shape his theories without resistance. Then suddenly, he vanished. The villagers said they last saw him near the barn, crouched low with his notebook, the glow reflecting in his spectacles. By morning he was gone, and all that remained was his notebook, soaked through with blood that had seeped into every page. The diagrams blurred, the words ran black, but here and there symbols remained visible, shapes not drawn by him, shapes that matched the lines the congregation once swore they had seen crawl beneath the child's skin. His body was never found. Some said he left, too frightened of what he uncovered. Others whispered the glow itself had swallowed him, pulling him into the soil as it had taken the children. The sheriff dismissed it as another drifter lost to his own madness. But the villagers remembered the way Hartwell had looked at the bones with wonder instead of grief. They remembered the strange hunger in his eyes when he said the child was unfinished. And they remembered the blood-soaked notebook, heavy with pages that whispered of patterns no man should ever try to complete. In his absence, the village understood something new, that silence was not the only danger. Obsession, too, could feed the glow, and those who tried to name it became part of the thing they studied. By the time the Ellison child reached his second year, hunger had become the rhythm of the house. At first, Ruth tried to keep to the old ways, feeding him with milk and soft bread mashed into her trembling hands. But the child refused. Milk burst into steam on his lips, scalding her fingers as if it touched fire. Bread blackened and crumbled into ash when he chewed, leaving soot on his teeth. Even when she tried meat boiled tender, it blackened in his mouth, the fat burning into a bitter smoke that hung in the room. Neighbors noticed the sour odor that leaked from her chimney, the stench of food spoiled in unnatural ways, and they began to say the boy was living on nothing, though Ruth knew he was feeding on something far worse. She grew thin as his hunger sharpened. At first she offered her arms when he wailed, rocking him until his mouth pressed against her skin. What began as a desperate mistake became ritual. She learned to cut thin strips of flesh from her forearm with a kitchen blade, offering them to him with shaking hands. He ate in silence, his small jaws working steadily, his glow brightening faintly with every swallow. Ruth stitched the wounds herself with black thread and trembling fingers. The scars lined her arms in parallel rows, crude but deliberate, like pages of a ledger recording debts that could never be repaid. She did not cry when she cut. She smiled faintly as if bleeding was a prayer answered. Those who glimpsed her knew. A farmer who delivered wood saw her binding her arm with strips of cloth soaked red, her face pale but serene. He swore she whispered softly as she worked, thanking something unseen for the privilege of sacrifice. When he told the others, they dismissed it as madness, yet none dared approach her again. They knew the burns from the early months, the strange welts that marked her skin from holding him. Now the wounds were not accidents but offerings. She had crossed the line between victim and servant, and the village turned away, for to confront her would be to admit what she had become. The boy's hunger grew bolder. When Ruth failed to cut quickly enough, he thrashed, his glow flaring in sudden bursts that left scorched marks on the crib. The wood itself warped and cracked, and the smell of burning pine filled the cabin, though no flame touched it. Once, when Ruth delayed, the glow burst so strong it seared a circle into the floorboards. She pressed her hand into it to calm him, the flesh of her palm blistering, and only then did the light subside. Witnesses said they heard her voice through the thin walls, whispering reassurance not as one soothes a child, but as one prays to a god. The scars on her arms grew into a map, each cut stitched and reopened, each wound a line of devotion. She walked through the village with her sleeves drawn down, but the shape of her arms told the truth. Her flesh carved thin, her strength drained. And yet when neighbors saw her eyes, they did not see despair. They saw a calmness, an almost holy serenity, as if she believed she had been chosen for this task. She spoke little, but her silence no longer felt like shame. It felt like devotion. The hunger within the boy was not only for flesh, but for the surrender it demanded. Ruth gave freely, and in return the glow thrived. By his second year, the boy no longer looked like other children. His skin was too pale, his eyes too deep, and the faint shimmer never left him even in daylight. He sat quiet most of the time, watching with a gaze too steady for his age, as though he understood what he was owed. And Ruth, with her scarred arms and quiet smile, gave it gladly. Those who passed the house at night said the glow was no longer confined to the crib. It seeped through the walls, spreading faintly into the yard, pulsing in rhythm with a heartbeat too strong for one small body. The villagers avoided the road altogether. They told themselves they were keeping safe, but deep down they knew they were avoiding the truth. That the glow was fed not by accidents, not by milk or meat, but by a mother's deliberate sacrifice, by flesh cut in secret, by love twisted into ritual. The hunger was no longer hidden. It had become the order of the house, the quiet covenant between mother and child. And though Ruth's body weakened with each passing month, her silence held steady, her hands steady with the blade, her smile faint but sure. She had accepted that her purpose was to feed the glow, and through her devotion it grew. What began as an infant's strange appetite had become something larger, something that no longer belonged only to the boy. It belonged to the dark itself, and the dark was learning it could ask for more. The summer of 1873 carried with it a strange heat, a heat that did not rise from the sun but from the very rooms where infants slept. It began with a single crib found smoldering at dawn, the baby within reduced to blackened ash. The mother swore she had left a bowl of water at the bedside, swore the fire had never touched the curtains or walls, only the small bed itself. Her cries rattled the village, but no one asked questions aloud. A week later, another crib burned, then another. It spread like a pattern no one wished to see. Each family struck with the same silent curse. Mothers woke to smoke that carried no flame, to the stench of charred flesh contained within neat wooden frames. Fathers tore down walls searching for signs of lightning or spark, but nothing explained the fires. It was as if the cribs themselves had been chosen to burn, as if each small bed had become an altar. The deaths stacked quietly, one after another, until the village pulsed with grief that had no outlet. At night they whispered of witchcraft. Some muttered that the Ellison child was the cause, though no one dared say it too loudly. For while their babies burned to ash, Ruth's boy remained untouched. Neighbors who passed her cabin swore they saw his faint glow through the cracks of the shutters, a steady pulse like a candle shielded from wind. His crib never burned, though wood identical to theirs framed it. His sheets never blackened, though his glow flared brightest in those weeks. It was as though the fire spared him, choosing instead to take all others. Ruth never spoke. She carried her son as before, her arms wrapped in bandages, her face calm, her silence heavy as stone. When women tried to question her, their voices faltered. Some said her eyes made them weak, others said her quiet was worse than denial, as if the absence of words itself was a spell. Men gathered at the tavern, but their anger never moved beyond mutters, for each felt the same crawling unease when they imagined standing before her. It was easier to blame the night, easier to bury their dead and call it fate than to face the mother whose child glowed while theirs turned to ash. By the end of that season, the village had lost nearly a dozen infants. No graves were dug. The ash was swept into jars, sealed in cupboards, placed on shelves like shameful relics. The preacher no longer spoke of angels. The sheriff no longer wrote names in his ledger. Both chose silence, for silence carried less weight than truth. And so the deaths passed like smoke, dissipating into the air while the Ellison cabin pulsed faintly at night, untouched, unharmed, and hungrier than ever. The discovery came by accident, as so many terrible truths do. A group of boys, restless after the string of infant deaths, dared each other to peer into the old stone well at the edge of the village. Its mouth had been boarded long ago, said to be dry, but when one boy pried loose the rotting planks, he swore a faint light glowed far below. Word spread quickly, and by dusk a handful of men gathered, driven not by bravery but by a need to prove the fear wrong. They lowered a lantern and rope, expecting only mud and ruin. What they found instead was a hollow chamber carved by hands, not by water. At the bottom lay rows of tiny coffins, each cut crudely from pine, lined with salt packed tight into every seam. Their lids bore no names, only scratches like shallow wounds. When opened, the coffins held no flesh, only bones arranged neatly, some so small they must have belonged to newborns. The bones did not rest dull. They emitted a faint glow, pulsing softly, as if the marrow still remembered the lives once carried within. The men staggered back, but their lantern light only deepened the glow as though feeding it. The walls of the chamber told more than the coffins. They were covered in faint scratches, small lines that together formed words written by uncertain hands. Over and over the same word appeared, uneven and desperate: hunger. It stretched across every surface, etched into stone with the insistence of a child who could not stop writing the same lesson. Some marks were fresh, others older, but all repeated the same cry: hunger, hunger, hunger. The men whispered that no adult hand had made them, that only children's fingers could carve so shallow, and they shivered with the thought of little ones pressed into darkness to scratch their final word into stone. At the chamber's heart stood an altar, hewn from a single block of granite, its edges rough but its top smoothed by countless touches. The surface glowed faintly, a dull light that throbbed with the same rhythm as the bones. Some swore they saw veins of light running through the stone, as if it had absorbed marrow itself. The altar smelled of iron, though no blood was visible. It radiated a presence neither hot nor cold, but heavy, pressing against the chest until each breath came short. The men could not look at it long. One dropped to his knees, retching. Another clawed at his face until he bled, insisting the glow was crawling into his eyes. They fled, leaving the coffins unsealed, the altar still pulsing. Above ground they tried to speak of what they had seen, but words failed. Some insisted the chamber did not exist, others swore they had seen it, but begged no one to return. The sheriff listened, then declared the well off limits, hammering the boards back into place and writing nothing in his book. He told the villagers it was empty, that there had been no coffins, no bones, no words. Silence once again smothered truth. But whispers spread regardless. Mothers said the glow from the well could be seen at night if one dared to look too closely, a faint light rising through the cracks in the wood. Children dreamed of coffins lined with salt, of small fingers scratching at stone, and they woke screaming the same word: hunger. Ruth heard the whispers too, but her face never changed. She rocked her glowing child in her arms and let the silence stretch, as though she knew the well's secret was not separate from her son, but part of him, an extension of his hunger laid into the earth long before anyone dared admit it. The village carried on, stepping wider circles around the well, pretending the boards sealed more than wood and stone. Yet beneath, the coffins remained, the altar still breathing its dull light, the word hunger carved into walls that would never forget. It was no longer just the child who bore the glow. It had seeped into the land itself, a hunger buried in salt and silence, waiting for the living to feed it again. The winter came sharp, the kind that cracks wood and freezes wells to silence. On the first morning of frost, the Ellison cabin stood with its door unlatched, drifting open in the wind. Inside, the fire was dead, the bed cold, and Ruth Ellison was gone. No shawl, no shoes, no trail pressed into the snow outside. Only the child remained lying in his crib with a stillness too complete for breath. Yet he breathed, faint and shallow, his glow stronger than ever before. It pulsed in rhythm, a dull throb beneath his skin, steady like a second heart. The villagers who dared step into the room swore they felt the glow beating against their own chests, as though their ribs were being tuned to his rhythm. The absence of Ruth unsettled them more than the glow itself. For years she had been the silent wall between the child and the world, her scars proof of a pact no one wished to name. Now that wall was gone. Some said she fled into the woods, consumed by madness, her body frozen beneath the pines. Others whispered she had been taken, not by man, not by beast, but by the very hunger she had served. Her bandages were found neatly folded on the chair, the needle she used to stitch her own wounds placed beside them. It was as if she had laid down her role, leaving the child behind like an offering. That night, the glow grew bolder. It filled the cabin, spilling through the cracks in the walls, casting faint beams onto the snow. Children woke from their beds swearing they heard whispers coming through the cold air, words too soft to catch but too sharp to ignore. Men sat upright, clutching their chests, certain someone had called their name from outside. Women prayed but stopped midway, their voices faltering as if another voice pressed against their own. The whispers threaded through the village, not loud, not clear, but steady, riding the rhythm of that second heart that now seemed to beat for them all. None dared take the child away. The sheriff came once, stood in the doorway, and left without touching him. He told the others there was nothing to fear, that Ruth would return, but the lines in his face betrayed him. He had seen the crib glowing like a lantern, had felt his breath falter as he looked at the boy's still eyes, open but unblinking. He had heard the whispers. He too chose silence. Weeks passed and Ruth did not return. Snow covered the village, blanketing the land in white. But the Ellison cabin glowed faintly at night, a steady beacon pulsing against the cold. Those who passed swore the whispers grew stronger the longer they lingered, pulling them closer as if the boy inside was no longer just sleeping but calling. Some believed Ruth had not left at all, that she had been folded into the glow itself, her flesh and silence devoured so the boy could feed alone. Whatever the truth, her absence was final. The mother who had once cut herself to keep him quiet was gone, and in her place remained only the hunger she had tended, now free to beat in the open, waiting for the village to answer. By the spring of 1873, the village no longer breathed as it once had. Whole families packed wagons in silence, leaving their houses standing but hollow. Doors unlatched, curtains swaying in empty windows. They carried only what their backs could bear, abandoning furniture, tools, even livestock, as though weight itself might drag them into the same fate that had claimed their children. The roads out of town filled with quiet departures, no goodbyes spoken, no promises of return. The few who remained did so out of stubbornness or paralysis or the strange conviction that running would only carry the glow further into the world. The Ellison cabin was left untouched. No one entered after Ruth's disappearance. Some swore they saw the glow through its cracks still, faint as a dying ember but steady. Others said the crib had gone dark, the child vanished into the woods or deeper into the soil beneath. No one could prove either story, for none dared to open the door. In time, the fear itself became enough. They lived with the truth that not knowing was safer than knowing, and so the cabin remained, a husk of wood holding silence that pressed against the hearts of those who passed too close. Rumors spread through nearby counties of livestock that glowed faintly at night, eyes shimmering like dull coals, hides lit with a soft pulse beneath the skin. Farmers spoke of calves born weak, their veins shining for a few nights before the light guttered and the flesh decayed. No one traced it to the village directly, but the stories bled together, and soon the land itself seemed infected. Fields that once yielded crops soured, milk thickened before it reached the table, and the cries of newborns carried too far in the night. It was as if the hunger that began in one crib had seeped into the soil and chosen to scatter itself across the land. The county court recorded nothing. Petitions about the missing children were filed, but the papers disappeared. Records of the village itself thinned until only a name remained, written in older ledgers, unaccompanied by detail. The sheriff who once looked away retired without word, and his book was found blank in the final pages, the names of the dead never written. To those who sought answers years later, the silence in the records was louder than confession. It was as if the officials themselves had decided the safest way to survive the truth was to erase it. Reverend Malachi Gray outlived most of the flock he once preached to, his body hollowed by blindness and the weight of memory. His last sermons were muttered from a chair rather than a pulpit, scraps of thought scribbled on torn paper. In his final days, he scrawled words that no one wished to read aloud. The child is the lantern of something beneath. When he died, the paper was burned by his successors, though the phrase clung to those who had seen it, passed like a curse from mouth to ear in secret. To them it confirmed what they already feared, that the glow had never belonged to the boy alone, but to something older, rooted deep in the ground, using him as its vessel. By the end of the year, the village had collapsed into ruin. Roofs sagged, wells dried, and only weeds grew where laughter once filled the air. The roads remained, but they carried only strangers passing through, unaware of what the soil held. For those who remembered, silence became survival, and so they carried the story not in words, but in wary glances and careful absences. The Ellison child was never seen again, yet his glow seemed to linger not in one place, but scattered like embers hidden in the bones of animals, in the flicker of fields at night, in the hush of families who had once called the village home. The town was buried not by earth, but by silence. And silence has always kept the hunger alive. In the years that followed, the story of the Ellison child dissolved like smoke into air, leaving behind no record that could be weighed against truth. The county's ledgers carried no trace of the infant deaths, no mention of the missing, no line for Ruth's disappearance. The court sealed its silence, and in time, official memory erased the village as though it had never stood at all. What remained were fragments scattered like ash, burned diaries recovered from hearths, their pages half legible, hymnals with passages blotted out, words too dangerous to be sung again. Crystals of salt dug from the ground decades later, faintly glowing when the moon was high. Each fragment spoke not in facts but in hints, threads of a horror too carefully hidden to survive in full. Those who fled the village carried the story in whispers. Families spoke of it only when pressed, and even then, only in shadows. They said a child had glowed faint as frost at first, then brighter, until its hunger spread from the crib to the soil itself. They told of mothers who fed it with flesh, of barns hiding bones arranged like patterns only the dark could read, of a well lined with coffins that pulsed with light. But each telling ended the same way: silence. No one ever spoke long, for to Name the child outright was to risk waking what had been buried. Over time, silence became a duty, an inheritance, passed down as carefully as land or blood. Children of survivors were raised to avoid certain questions, to step wide circles around certain truths. The scientific world, which might have sought evidence, left no report. Men like Julian Hartwell, whose notebooks once burned with frantic sketches of marrow turned to glass, were spoken of only as drifters lost to madness. Doctors who might have signed certificates left their pages blank. The silence of authority was not ignorance, it was survival. For to study such a child was to risk being claimed by it, as Crowell had been, as Hartwell had been, as Malachi had been when the light burned his sight away. Even in their detachment, the learned men knew the danger. To write it down was to give it form, and form gave it room to live. And so they chose omission, which is its own kind of pact with evil. Yet the land itself never forgot. Farmers in neighboring counties found calves born with faint glows in their veins, their bodies too weak to last, their marrow curdling into light before death claimed them. Shepherds swore their flocks carried eyes that shimmered faintly when no lanterns burned. Hunters in the woods told of bones buried shallow in the dirt, glowing faintly like embers when disturbed. None of these tales were carried into record, yet they persisted in hushed tones as though the soil carried its own memory, feeding small echoes of the hunger that once lived in one crib. And then there were the relics. Broken hymnals, their leather scorched, a farmer's diary waterlogged but bearing one final entry. The glow follows. It does not end. A jar of salt crystals unearthed by children playing near the abandoned well, the grains faintly luminescent when held to the dark. These were dismissed as curiosities, never gathered into study, yet each was a reminder that the story could not be killed, only buried. Even in fragments, the silence spoke louder than words. The preacher's last line lived longest. Past mouth to ear, it hardened into a warning that clung for generations. The child is the lantern of something beneath. None agreed on what lay beneath, hell, the earth, hunger itself, but all agreed that it was not the boy alone. He had been vessel, not source. His glow was a mask, and what it masked was deeper, older, waiting. That was why the survivors never built memorials, never carved names, never dared gather in mourning. To remember was to invite, and to invite was to feed. Better to let absence carry the weight than to risk recognition. And so the legacy of the Ellison child became not a story told openly, but a hush that carried forward, shaping lives in ways unseen. Mothers who lost children spoke little, but their silence became a lesson, a shaping hand that taught their daughters to endure, their sons to look away. The silence spread like a stain, reaching into churches, into courts, into homes, until it became a part of the culture itself, a fear that evil thrives best when given no name. What remains for us now is the question that haunts more than the glow itself. Was it supernatural, something birthed from the dark to test the living? Or was it only human cruelty, a hidden mind that bent innocence into ritual, a mother who surrendered herself to madness until the hunger fed on her as much as on her child? Was the glow real, or was it the reflection of our own refusal to look at suffering, our instinct to bury horror rather than face it? The silence has left us no answer, and perhaps that is the truest horror of all. For evil does not always roar. It does not always wear horns or bear knives. Sometimes it hides in silence, in the blank spaces of ledgers, in the pages never written, in the names never carved into stone. Sometimes it lives on in the way entire towns choose to forget, in the way families teach their children not to ask, in the way truth rots into rumor until only fragments remain. And those fragments, faint as they are, still glow when the night is darkest. So we are left with this, a child who glowed at night, a village that vanished into silence, a hunger that fed not only on flesh but on fear. The story was never written into record, but it survives here in whispers, in fragments, in the questions we cannot quiet. What do you think? Could this happen again? Could silence still protect something like this, waiting for the dark to let it shine once more?